One of the worst things that a Christian can do is overextend themselves. We see it all the time. Many times we call it burnout. We call it by different names. And it's a very tragic, tragic place. Now, why do people overextend? Well, the Apostle Paul is going to talk about that in verse 14 of 2 Corinthians, the 10th chapter. Why do people overextend themselves? They overextend themselves when they look and they compare themselves to someone else. The Apostle Paul in verse number 13 was talking about a measure, and he's talking actually about a measuring spoon, like a teaspoon or a tablespoon. And he's saying, you know what, don't go beyond the measure that God has given you. And then we ended yesterday by saying this, if you go beyond the measure God's given to you, the chances are you're not going to reach the people that God has given you to reach. Because Paul says, you know what, this is my measure to reach you, the Corinthians. And now we start in verse number 14, and it says, for we are not overextending ourselves. Now the Apostle Paul, his ministry was absolutely amazing. Where he went and what he done was absolutely amazing. So we have to get this understanding that all of the places that the Apostle Paul went, he went there because God had ordained him. The Apostle Paul is trying to go into Asia, and the Holy Spirit not going to let him go into Asia, and he's in Troas, I believe it was. And God comes to him and he gets the Macedonian call. Well, you know what the results of the Macedonian call were? The church at Philippi, the church in Thessalonica, the church at Corinth, going to Athens. What was Paul doing? Paul was operating in the measure that he was given by God. But then he says, we are not overextending ourselves. We are not going beyond what God has given us to do. Even though the Apostle Paul's ministry was great, he was not overextending, because when you overextend, you get yourself in a world of trouble. Then the Apostle Paul goes on in verse number 14, as if we did not reach to you. Paul is saying, you know what? We could have overextended ourselves and gone on into Asia. We could have gone on into China and gone to India. We could have gone a lot of different places, but we didn't overextend ourselves. Because if we would have overextended ourselves, chances are we would not have reached you. We could have gone into Thessalonica and then say, hey, let's go to Rome. Let's go to the big city. And there's a lot of people in Rome now. Paul will eventually get to Rome, but he'll get to Rome as a prisoner. But you understand how important it is that we all stay in the place, in the measure, if I could use that word, that God has given to us. Because as soon as we move outside of that measure, we are risking the possibility of not reaching the people that God has given us to reach. I believe in missionaries. I believe 100% in missionaries. I've traveled around the world preaching the gospel as a missionary. But you know what? I don't believe everybody should be a missionary. Now, I do think everybody should go on a mission trip. But I don't believe everybody should be a missionary. Why? Because there's people that need to be reached right in your own hometown, in your neighborhood. And if you go fly off to India or to Africa or someplace like that, chances are they're not going to be reached. So ask yourself this question. Actually, ask God this question. What's my measure? What did you create me for? And so Paul says, as if we did not reach to you, for we were the first to come, even as far as you in the gospel of Christ. How many of you realize that the city of Corinth was the furthest out that anybody had ever brought the gospel? Now, eventually, Rome is going to hear the gospel through persecuted Christians. But at this time, Corinth was the furthest place that the gospel had been spread in the world. And Paul says, you know what? Because it was the measure of God, that's why we came to you. Wow. Because God was directing us. Because God was leading us to the Achaia Peninsula. God was leading us to Corinth. That's why we came to you. Now, moving on to verse number 15. Not boasting beyond our measure. There we got this word measure again, talking about a measuring spoon. We're not going to talk about going beyond the measure. And he says, that is, in other man's labors. What's Paul saying? He said, we're not going to boast about what other men have done. We're going to stay in our measure. We're going to just talk about what God has given us to do. How many of you know people like to boast about what someone else does? And sometimes they even take credit for what someone else does. When we were in the Soviet Union as missionaries, there was a man who would come to our meetings, and he would constantly take pictures of our meetings. And I really wasn't bothered by it until someone came up to me and they said, you know, you need to see this guy's newsletter. He's taking credit for what you're paying for. He's taking credit for what you're doing in the Soviet Union. Well, Paul is saying we're not going to do that. We're not going to boast beyond our measure, that is, in other men's labors, but with the hope that as your faith grows. What is Paul's objective for the Corinthians? That their faith would grow. We've talked about this week. We talked about it last week. Paul's objective was not to be domineering. Paul's objective was not to destroy the faith of the Corinthians. Paul's objective was that their faith would grow. And so Paul writes and he says, but with the hope, the expectancy. Paul is expecting their faith to grow. He says, and with the hope that as your faith grows, we will be within your sphere enlarged even more. Notice what Paul is saying here. Paul is saying, you know what? As we cause you to grow, we're going to grow. Our sphere is going to grow. Our influence is going to grow. Actually, the word sphere it can be literally translated as a cane. But it was a cane that was used to examine things. They would take a cane and they would hold it out and say, oh, that's the measure. Oh, yeah, it's a half a cane. It's a full cane. It's a three-quarter cane. And so Paul is talking about a measure. What's Paul saying? He's saying, as we are helping you, as we are causing you to grow, you know what? We are also growing. Wow, what a statement. Join us again tomorrow as we continue our study in the book of 2 Corinthians.